When I was born, my name was originally Wolf Tomasz. When we arrived in Australia, I anglicised the Tomasz to Thomas, which is its equivalent, and retained the family names. I was born in Budapest in Hungary in 1946. My dad was a concentration camp survivor. My mother was a Budapest ghetto survivor. She was one of the Wallenberg people, along with my sister. My sister was aged 5 when I was born, but she was three and a bit when they were on the way to be shot at the banks of the Danube, and they managed to escape and survive. Otherwise I wouldn't be here today. After the Second World War, when my dad came back from the concentration camps, he was a master weaver, he was a loom tuner. And because of his professional skills, he was elevated and elevated and elevated. Because he was a socialist, ended up being fairly the manager of a very, very big textile mill, and for that you had to be a senior communist member. When the revolution broke out in 1956, and it wasn't the revolution itself, it was the fact that the Russians then came back in. It was rather obvious that there's got to be a change of communist powers in Hungary. My father didn't feel safe because whereas pre-revolution it was communism A, and after the revolution was obviously going to be communism B, and there was going to be a purge of sorts, we had to get out. So we're genuine political refugees in that sense. We left Hungary in December of 1956. The revolution broke out on the 23rd of October in 1956. The building where we were living on one of the main avenues of Budapest called Rákóczi út, and we lived almost directly across the road from the radio station. So when the Russian tanks came back in early November, our home, a block of apartments we lived in, was one of the first ones to be hit with incendiaries and went up in flames. Our apartment wasn't affected at all, but at that time we were hiding in the coal cellar downstairs. We basically walked across the border, my father, my mother, my sister and myself, and another family that ended up going to Canada. We walked across the border on, I think it's about the 20th or the 21st of December in 1956. By the time we crossed the border, the Russians were fully in control of the borders. So there were flares going up into the sky, and we had to duck down and dive down into what was then already snow on the ground. It took us, I think, about 4 hours to cross 1.5 kilometres to get into Austria. Once we arrived in Austria, we moved on to Vienna, got assistance there from an organisation called HIAS, which is a Jewish welfare agency, international welfare agency. We were then put into a refugee camp in Austria, first in a place called Korneuburg, and then in Salzburg itself. And from there we went by train to Naples, where we boarded the ship to come to Australia. The ship is the Flaminia, which actually was a fairly well-recognised migrant ship at the time. It did a number of journeys to Australia. The family that we came out with had family here in Australia. So what we said, well, let's stick together. We both applied to travel together to Canada. We both applied to travel together to Australia. We got the Australian visa. When we arrived here, we got picked up at the dock by a complete stranger who introduced himself. It was a guy called Eddie Geyer, who became a very well-known Sydney caterer, a kosher caterer, and he ran a hostel up at Greenwich for the Jewish Welfare Society called Chipchas. And we were taken to Chipchas like many, many other migrants who had nowhere else to go. And to this day I still know quite a few of the kids that I was together with at Chipchas, and not just Hungarians. And it was an interesting time in my life. From Greenwich, we moved to Bondi, or to Waverley, then to Bondi, and I went to Bondi. No, I didn't. I went to Waverley Public School on Bronte Road, where the police station is, and the school is still there. From there, I ended up going to Vaucluse High, but my first impression was it was a challenge. I knew no English. The first probably 4 or 5 years were extremely tough. Dad worked 2 jobs, Mum worked until 3 o'clock in the morning, pedalling on her sewing machine at home. I'd be up until 3 o'clock in the morning, snipping the corners of the sleeves and the collars to make sure that they lay nice and flat. Mum and sister opened up a market stall at Paddy's Markets. Very successful. Mum was an absolute genius. She could look at somebody wearing a garment and reproduce it within 5 minutes. So we were always first with the latest fashion at Paddy's Markets. By the time the others woke up to this being the fashion, we'd already sold out and we were on the next line. I know quite a bit about the clothing industry, which is why I became a lawyer, to get out